cannot live out moral relativism. It is impossible. If your sister is raped and murdered, you cannot kick back and say, oh, it's relative. No, the way you're hardwired informs you that justice has been totally violated when that perpetrator attacked your sister. And therefore, you cry out for justice, not in a relative sense, but in an objective, absolute sense.
A student corners Cliffe with a challenge that cuts to the core of human existence. If morality is relative, does justice even mean anything? What follows is a raw, unfiltered debate between Cliffe, a pastor convinced that objective moral truth is anchored in God, and a sharp, atheist student who argues that justice is simply what society agrees on at any given moment. Cliffe pushes hard, invoking Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, the horrors of the Bosnian War, and the cross of Christ itself. The student pushes back coolly, logically, refusing to yield. At stake is not just a philosophical argument, but the very foundation of human dignity, forgiveness, and whether evil ever truly loses. Now, let's step into the conversation.
See, I like to think of it like this. A man-eating lion, for example. I mean, a man-eating lion, he can't really be held responsible for what it does, but it still needs to be found and shot to prevent harm. So a criminal, though they might have no free will on what they did, they still need to be locked away. They still need to be removed from society. It's just, that's just the way the world works, and they need to be punished for even your own vindication, because it makes you feel good to see them punished, even though they had no choice in the matter. It still makes you feel good to see them punished, and it removes them from society. So that's why you do it.
Okay, good. Talk to me about, it makes me feel good to see someone punished for the evil that they did. It sounds to me like you appreciate justice.
Right. Most people do, yes.
Okay, good. But if all of reality is simple matter and energy evolved to a higher order, what is justice?
It's what you perceive it to be. What you and your peers agree on as defining as justice. I mean, there's a reason why it used to be if you were caught sleeping with, the neighbor's wife, you'd be killed or whatever. And now you might just get divorced. There's different changes in what's considered justice. It used to be a literal eye for an eye, and now it's just more metaphorical. I mean, what you define as retribution and justice is very dependent on what everyone agrees on.
Is justice real, or is it simply an arbitrary value that everybody agrees on? What do you think?
Arbitrary value that everyone agrees on.
Arbitrary value, okay. Dr. Martin Luther King is in jail in Birmingham, Alabama. The white ministers in Birmingham have said, Dr. Martin Luther King, you need to understand that the laws of the great state of Alabama legislate segregation. You, Dr. Martin Luther King, by invading the great state of Alabama and coming to Birmingham to try and change those laws, you're out of line. So get back into line. Dr. Martin Luther King writes a letter from the Birmingham jail to the ministers of Birmingham saying, gentlemen, there is a law above the law of the great state of Alabama. And if the great state of Alabama cannot legislate laws that are in agreement with the laws of God, then the laws of the state of Alabama are wrong. They are unjust. Do you think Dr. Martin Luther King was tripping on drugs, or do you think he was in touch with reality?
Basically, in my opinion, I believe that, yes, those laws were unjust, but the people at the time came from a point of view at which they thought that was what was just for them. And it's a good thing that it changed. It's a good thing that people now have, I guess, a better sense of what really is just. But at the time, that's what that society constructed as moral. And it's a good thing that everybody was able to reconsider, was able to reevaluate and overthrow these illogical, harmful policies. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, I guess it doesn't negate the fact that the people still came about and tried to make what was best in their mind for their society.
Who defines better sense of justice?
As I said, you and your current peers. And so currently right now, everyone here, I would assume, is in agreement with the fact that segregation is wrong, because we have our own logical, persuasions as to why that's the case. And we're going to fight to keep that the case. But those people at the time, I'm sure they had their own justifications as to why segregation was necessary. And obviously, by our standards now, we can see the irrational aspect of that, but they were doing what they thought was best. And obviously, by our standpoint, it was wrong. And it's a good thing they got rid of it. But I don't understand why that detracts from the arbitrary nature of justice.
Well, then I haven't been able to communicate very well. Because obviously, Dr. Martin Luther King's whole argument was, you are right, white ministers of Birmingham. I am violating the laws of my culture, the state of Alabama. The only way you can critique your culture is if you believe that there is a law above the law of your culture. If you don't believe that there's a law above the law of your culture, how do you critique your culture?
Because you just come to different conclusions. Martin Luther King looked at the situation and said, having African Americans subjugated is bad on all these different levels, and here's why it needs to be changed. And he went about and found other people who agreed with him, rallied, organized it, and helped get those laws changed based off of, and everyone saw the moral and rational logic for it and had those laws changed to match with their new definition of what is moral and what's just. And I mean, you use from what your own logic to critique your society. It doesn't necessarily, you can get inspiration from the Bible or the Quran or any sort of philosophy that you want to help shape your mind. I mean,
right. But if you are an atheist, if you think there is no God, then you have no rational intellectual basis for believing that there's an objective moral. Nietzsche poured scorn on fellow atheists who said there is no God, but do unto others as you would have them do unto you is a good thing. He says, no, it's not a good thing in any objective sense. Maybe you want to call it good, but that's your own ephemeral prejudice, bias. It's all relative.
Basically, I agree that it's all relative, but you see, what people say is, I'm not a nihilist because though it's relative, it's not meaningless.
Oh, really? Why not?
Because it has meaning to me. And that's how?
Yeah.
Because that's how I'm hardwired to feel certain ways in response to different things.
Good. But with your head, you understand that if you murder me or if you feed me dinner, it's meaningless. So just choose whatever option you choose. Either murder me or give me dinner. It's meaningless.
No, it's meaningful to me because, okay, for example, if I were to murder you from a pragmatic point of view, I would obviously face the repercussions of society. But from a moral stand of view, I wouldn't want to murder you, period. And also, it would cause grief to your family, to my family, and it'd just be bad for everyone in general. So that's why I don't do it. Not because, oh, the Bible says not to, because it's against a commandment, I don't want to go to hell. It has nothing to do with hell. Basically, I do basically what I want to do because it makes me feel right, not because I fear judgment, not because I fear some sort of, eternal damnation.
Oh, now, wait a second. You know very, very well that you appreciate judgment. You know very, very well that you appreciate evil being apprehended. That's judgment.
Right.
So all that Jesus is saying when he talks about hell is that God is good, God is just, and evil ultimately loses. Evil does not ultimately win. That's why there's a hell. That's what hell is. Hell is a statement. Evil ultimately loses. Evil will be judged. It will ultimately be apprehended. It will lose. It is not eternal. It'll be destroyed. Now, remember, your worldview says no. Evil will win.
No?
Of course it does.
Sometimes, I guess it depends what you define as evil, but I guess the way I would define evil usually actually tends to lose because people, I don't think, are inherently evil, because being evil is very socially destructive. I don't think people are naturally evil, and thus, if you look at these very totalitarian states and regimes, they usually end up losing to a freer, more harmonious society where people are more happy. So I don't think evil necessarily wins. I don't think good necessarily wins, but I do think it's usually somewhere in the middle of what the status quo is.
Right, but if there is no God, if there is no day of judgment, sir, the good die young at times. And evil, corrupt people get away with murder, get away with stealing. And selfish people, selfish men, rip off their wives, divorce them. And some parents are incredibly irresponsible, abuse their children emotionally, physically. They never get apprehended. So if there is no God, there is no day of judgment, and evil wins, sir. And I can promise you, the typical African American is not ultimately going to get justice and fairness in this life, especially if they were born here 100 years ago. So evil wins too frequently in this world, in the here and now. And if there is no God, if there is no day of judgment, then ultimately evil wins.
Got to try your best to oppose it, but that's just the brutal nature of existence.
Good. That's why despair is the only logical conclusion for you as an atheist.
Why despair?
Because evil wins too often. Evil wins. Suck it up, realize it, that's reality. And you have no hope that goodness and justice will ultimately triumph. If you're a secularist, if you're an atheist, you're saying this is all there is to reality, and if you're born on the wrong side of the tracks, and if you're born HIV positive, tough luck. It's the way the ball bounces.
You hope things get better. You hope that basically things do swing, as, for example, as you pointed out, in certain times, very evil situations arise, as in Nazi Germany or, Japan,
Right.
World War II. Those kind of situations do arise, and they can swing back more towards the middle ground, as in, philosophies do change. Slavery is abolished.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can have hope that things are going to move in what you view as the ideal situation. And I just think by human nature, though, yes, I don't think there'll ever be heaven on earth. There's never going to be a perfection, a utopia, but I think we are progressing more and more towards something as close as we can get to that.
Okay. Let me tell you why I'm glad there's a hell. There will be a hell. Miroslav Volf, who teaches at Yale Divinity School, wrote a book called Exclusion and Embrace. Miroslav Volf is a Croatian. Miroslav Volf has watched Bosnian Serbs rape Muslim women. Miroslav Volf has watched Muslims rape and murder other Croatians. Miroslav Volf began to think about it. He began to ask himself, who are the people who can forgive? Who are the people who are trapped in this cycle of retaliation, revenge? Retaliation, revenge. Miroslav Volf began to realize it's the people who understand that there's a day of judgment coming and there's a holy, good God who will punish evil, who are in a position to forgive. Those who believe simply that God is non-existent or that God is simply love cannot forgive. Why? When you see your sister raped and murdered, you have such a cry for justice welling up within you that the idea, oh, you know why you shouldn't do evil? Because evil ultimately doesn't win, is hollow, empty, and meaningless. The power to forgive, Miroslav Volf began to realize, ultimately comes when you begin to realize God is just. Because God is just, there will be a day of judgment. You as a human being are to forgive. But that human being will be judged by God one day for the atrocities that they have committed. And Miroslav Volf does a great job saying, now wait a second. If you live in the United States and you got a nice police force and a nice National Guard and a strong military, and if you live in the comfort of suburbia, of course you can sit back and say, well, God is all loving, so everybody goes to heaven if there is a heaven. And you shouldn't do evil because evil doesn't work. It's not pragmatically wise. But if you live in a situation where your children are being raped and murdered, justice so cries out that the only way to forgive that person and not sink into a cycle of retaliation and revenge is to understand that God will judge evil and evil will ultimately lose. It's a powerful argument he makes in that book, Exclusion and Embrace.
But I would argue that I think I agree. I see why, and I almost agree with that. As in, if somebody raped and murdered my sister and got away with it, there's plenty of movies about this, law-abiding citizen, whatever. I would go out and kill that person. And I would, if they caught me, I would accept my punishment. I would say it was worth it. To kill that human being was worth my life being ruined.
Why?
Because I couldn't live with the fact that that person went unpunished by my definition of what I would want to see punishment.
Why?
Because I couldn't live with myself otherwise. That's how
Why?
I feel. That's how I feel. And other people, they would say, well, it hurts me so bad, but you know what? I love my life too much to give it up for this pursuit of justice. It doesn't mean that much to me. And that's their own opinion. And that's how they act. But the way I act is I would need to see that justice brought to fruition.
Good. In other words, sir, you cannot live out moral relativism. It is impossible. If your sister is raped and murdered, you cannot kick back and say, oh, it's relative. No, the way you're hardwired informs you that justice has been totally violated when that perpetrator attacked your sister. And therefore, you cry out for justice, not in a relative sense, but in an objective, absolute sense.
But I'm saying, though it's relative, it's still meaningful to me. That's the whole point, is that though morals are all relative, it doesn't mean that they don't have meaning to you. Your morals may be arbitrary, but they still have a personal connection to you. So it doesn't matter that there's no absolute precedent for it. It just, you do what makes you feel right. And that's enough to make you act that way.
All right. Now, that's why you should understand, I think, the cross of Christ. Because the cross of Christ brings together justice and forgiveness in a marvelous way. The cross of Christ is not a pretty sight. There's agony, there's injustice, but Christ insisted that he was laying down his life to pay the penalty for your wrongdoing and for my wrongdoing. I'm a dirty, rotten sinner. I deserve God's wrath for my selfishness, my pride, my greed, my racism, all of my evil. But Christ bled and died on a cross, taking the hit that I deserve for my evil, thereby offering me forgiveness. And so the whole issue of love of God and justice of God come together magnificently at the cross of Christ. And you understand both. I don't think you're willing to live out your moral relativism. I think you know that justice is a real value. And that's why you say, Cliff, I would go out and kill the guy who raped and murdered my sister. And I asked you, why? You say, well, because I just feel that way. Right. And we'll just get in touch with that. That's very real, that conscience that informs you that the rape and murder of my sister is absolutely evil. Not relatively evil, it's absolutely evil. So evil that I'm going to go after the guy who murdered her and raped her and kill the guy.
Right. I mean, obviously, it wasn't immoral to the guy who did it, and so obviously he thought it was okay.
Right.
He, ran it through his head, and that seemed like a good idea to him.
Right.
And you know what? It doesn't matter to me that that's his value, and that's what he assigns to life. It has no value to me. What that means to me is that I'm going to live by my code, and he'll live by his code. And basically, luckily, I live in a society where most people share my code, and hopefully I could get him sentenced to life imprisonment or the best punishment that our society deems.
And so you're right there where I would never want to go, which is morality comes out of the barrel of a gun. Because the police supports you and doesn't support him in your relative morality, you win because you got the power. I think if you think about that, that's scary.
I mean, that's the only way it can be, right? I mean,
no.
Honestly.
As a follower of Christ, I know very well that if you have 25 guns behind you,
right,
and you go on date rape, you're doing that which is absolutely, objectively evil. I don't care how much power you got. I don't care how many guns you have behind you, because I'm convinced there is a real value of justice that your date rape is a total violation of.
Right.
But you see, you can't be in that position. All you can say is, well, subjectively, from my perspective, date rape is wrong. And then you say, okay, now what I've got is I've got my 25 guns behind me, so if I want to date rape, it's all relative, and that's okay. I mean, that is despair if you think about it. Life is meaningless. Doesn't matter whether you date rape her or whether you respect her.